Mario Kart World introduced some new mechanics to the franchise to spice up the driving, such as wall rides, charge jumps and rail grinds. All of these are associated with getting away from the ground, so I wanted to see how many tracks you could complete in Mario Kart World without touching the ground at all. Now, of course, there is an obvious problem with this challenge. As soon as you load into a track, you will fail immediately because you are touching the ground from the start. So, I needed to create some rules to give myself a chance and make it as interesting as possible. Firstly, I will only be trying to complete one lap of each track without touching the ground, so each attempt will only begin as soon as I cross the finish line at the end of lap 1. Secondly, I will be using custom items and only turning on the feather, an item that essentially lets you jump higher than you could normally. I will then give myself 2 feathers before each attempt starts, and also 20 coins if I need it. Basically anything to help me out, as this is a very difficult challenge. After each attempt starts, I will only be able to get more feathers if I can grab an item box without touching the ground, so I won't just be tackling every single problem as if I have infinite feathers to use. I will allow myself to use the rewind button to help out though, and you'll see how later in the video. The final thing to consider is, what actually counts as the ground? Now, you could go with just any surface you drive normally on counts as the ground, but that would include places like rooftops of buildings and highly elevated platforms, which I felt would take away from the challenge. So, I decided to go with a different definition. Any driving surface that could be accessed from the start of a race without your vehicle ever losing contact with the floor, outside of forced jumps and gliders, would count as the ground for this video, including water as well. For example, on Guy Bazaar, the road at the start of the track and anything directly connected to it will count as the ground, but the top path on the right will not, because you can only get there by initially jumping onto a rail or climbing up a wall. Now, there is one track that is still a bit dodgy with this definition, but I'll talk about that when we get there. I should also mention I'm allowing myself to touch boost panels, glider panels and bounce pads as well. If you can't tell, I was trying to be as lenient as possible when making the rules here. With everything explained, let's now see how many tracks can be completed, and trust me, I discovered some crazy things. Starting off on Mario Bros circuit, the first turn has an obvious rail path to take, but I needed 2 feathers to get there. This was a problem because I clearly needed at least 1 feather bounce for the next section, so I needed to save a feather when jumping onto the first rail. I thought that you could possibly wall ride the side of the finish line pole, but at first I couldn't attach properly. However, I just needed to approach it with less speed, because that gave me time to attach and then jump back off, which did get me far enough to land on the rail with only 1 feather bounce. After making that, I tried jumping to the next rail on the right with the other feather I had, but I quickly realised that the left rail was the much more viable option if I could gather some more speed. My method to get more speed was to slow down on the rail to gather an ultra mini turbo, but when I tried it here, it didn't actually get me far enough, so I had to think of other ideas. Straight away, I thought the wall on the left could come in handy, so I tried jumping onto it and did actually manage to attach, albeit it was from further back than the end of the rail. As a result, when I combined it with a feather bounce, I didn't really get any closer to the yellow rail, but it wasn't the only idea I had with the wall. Instead of feathering after the wall ride, what if I feathered onto the wall instead? Well, straight away I made it to the barriers, which looked more promising, but every attempt after that had the exact same outcome. So I went back to the first idea again, but this time I tried getting onto the wall much later and it seemed like it might actually work. Lo and behold, on the next attempt I got onto the wall, and the feather bounce afterwards gave me more than enough height to land on the yellow rail, getting me past my first significant barrier of the challenge. The track wasn't completed yet though, and this next section was what I was most worried about. After you grind the rail for a bit, there is a massive spiral right turn with no rails in sight, but there are a couple of things that gave me the slightest bit of hope. Firstly, I got 2 more feathers from the double box, and then I could jump onto the left wall for some extra distance. From there though, I only really had 2 options, either go for a long wall ride on the inside of the turn, or use the poles and arrows on the left side to somehow stay airborne the whole time. It became clear to me that the latter of those options would not be possible after trying it only once, and to be honest, the wall ride wasn't looking promising either. Whenever I got close to the wall, it would never actually let me attach to it thanks to the angle of my approach, but the bigger problem was that if I were to attach, any jump back off the wall just goes directly below the road, so I sadly had to rule that Mario Bros Circuit is not possible without touching the ground. Next up is Crown City, which of course has 3 different sections rather than 3 laps of one circuit. So what I decided to do here was just jump onto the rail that is behind you when you start the race, so I would still technically be starting the section from somewhere off the ground. Anyway, my first problem was that the jump from the red rail to the blue rail needed 2 feathers, but then the next jump isn't at all possible. Luckily, you can save a feather by bouncing off the umbrella next to the dash food stand, making both the gaps possible with 2 total feather bounces. After that, you can get onto the next rail with the help of a lamppost bounce, but then the rail just ends with nowhere really to go. However, I had a way to get 2 more feathers here thanks to the rewind button. By doing a precise jump to the left, I can get the item box, then rewind back onto the rail without ever touching the ground. Then if I do it again, I get my second feather, allowing me to keep progressing through the track. These feathers were definitely worth grabbing, because I could use one after bouncing off a tree to get all the way onto the uphill rail on the left path, letting me settle on the rooftops with 1 feather left. The gap over to the next rooftop is a big one, but I was pretty confident I could make it over. To do so, I did some parkour over to the building next to me, then did a wall ride to the top, then did a very cool trick sequence that worked out really well, landing on the left side of the next section of buildings. Below me there is another item set, so I could drop down onto the double box to replenish my feathers again for the next part. From the rooftop you can get onto the middle rail, but then you have the left turn with the huge grass shortcut. However, there is a very convenient ledge next to the shortcut, and after a few attempts I used my 2 feathers to land on it. From there, I once again replenished my feathers from the item boxes, but then I was not sure what to do. My first idea was to get on top of a vehicle using a feather, but when I tried getting onto a bus, I realised the angle I was approaching from wasn't going to allow me to. So, what I did instead was jump off the fence and then feather bounce all the way onto the opposite building. Now I had a much better approach angle to get on a vehicle, and after a couple of attempts I managed to land on the lorry, which then took me all the way to the end of section 1, making it possible without touching the ground. As for section 2 and 3, I'm actually going to come back to those later in the video because it gets pretty complicated and I feel I should talk about some other tracks first. Whistle Stop Summit is not complicated at all though, because you can get on the rail before the finish line, then just stay on it for a while until you reach the bridge, then do a couple of jumps over to the right rail, then stay on that through the cave section, then you can trick back onto the train tracks, and then you can just do the difficult ending shortcut and you'll have avoided ground for the entire thing. It is very much the simplest track in the video. It would even be easy to do this for all 3 laps, you would just have to make sure the train doesn't get in your way like it is here. DK Spaceport is yet another section track, so I got my 2 feathers at the start, then climbed the wall before the finish line. I could stay on the left for the first straightaway, then jump to the rail on the right side of the turn using 1 feather. After that there is a bigger gap to get across, but I could tell the poles would be useful here. And I was right, because I then managed to jump off the rail and bounce off 2 poles to land on the wall, which then got me to the glider section without using my other feather. The next part was a bit of a problem though, because the rail was quite far away from the ramp and wall riding likely wasn't going to work. However, I realised that I could actually get here with 2 feathers by using my first one as I hit the item boxes. This made the glider section much easier, as I could just jump off the second ramp and use 2 feathers to get onto the rail that seemed too far away at first. The next item boxes came soon after, so I could replenish my feathers then make an easy jump over to the other side, taking me around the turn completely. There is then a bounce pad that got me on the right rail, then soon after I could trick onto another bounce pad to get onto the lower rail at the end of the straightaway. Then I could once again use a feather as I hit the item set to carry 2 feathers into section 3. I needed those feathers as well, as the next jump from rail to rail is quite a long one. On my second attempt, I used the ultra mini turbo strategy to give myself the extra speed I needed to get over the gap, but then I got absolutely owned by a barrel straight after. On a following attempt I did avoid this barrel, letting me get onto the next rail which carried me to the end of section 3. After replenishing my feathers again, I used one of them to get onto the middle rails in section 4, which allowed me to get through nearly the whole thing. I did have to use another feather at the end, but I could land on the rail and simultaneously get 2 more feathers, so I had no problems here. I knew section 5 would be possible thanks to the pointless rail on the outside of the track, although I did find it tricky to get onto at first. Eventually I did manage it with only 1 feather, and as expected I needed the second feather at the other end. I had to use the feather to land on the left rail, then jump into the double box, then rewind, then use one of the new feathers to get back on the left rail, then use the other new feather to go from that rail to the right rail, rail, getting 2 more feathers in the process. The final section is the easiest of the lot. You just jump on the bounce pad and then stay on the right rail until the very end, where you stay away from the Robo DK and use 1 feather to cross the finish line, making DK Spaceport entirely possible. So, we've had a few success stories to start off the challenge, but Desert Hills is up next, which isn't ideal. The start of this track has the finish line and a cliff on the right, and to be fair, the latter does have a use here. I managed to climb up the wall and use 1 feather to get on top of the hill where the spectators are, but when you try to go anywhere to the right off the back of that, Lakitu has enough of you running over Yoshi and Toad and puts you back on the track. The only other idea I had was to use the glider panel at the end of the track to somehow make more progress, but I was quickly shown that it was absolutely useless, since it forces you to go down towards the track so you get no height whatsoever. So I quickly ruled out Desert Hills and moved on to Guy Bazaar. As I mentioned in the intro, I could immediately take the rail on the right to go towards the top path. I had many options from there, and I decided to take the shortcut route but then just trick between the rails until I got to the S-bend. Immediately, at the end of the final rail, I knew I needed to use a feather and then wrap around the outside wall, but I failed it on my first try. I got it soon afterwards though by dropping onto the ledge below me to get a bit more distance, which then took me to the red rail on the other side. After that there is a straightaway with many rails and jumps, with the ideal path seemingly being to land on the right rail of the boost ramp. From there I thought that getting onto the high rail on the right would be the best move to make the glider panel easier to reach, however when I tried to trick up there using the ramp I couldn't get high enough. So instead, I settled for tricking to the left, hoping I would figure out the rest anyway. Luckily, you can still get to the glider from here, as you can wall ride on the small tower to the left and then use the feather to reach the glider panel. I did have to rewind a bunch of times before I actually got the glider to activate, but in doing so I got feathers from the item boxes. The glider itself forces you towards the ground though, so the only hope I thought I would have is if I could use the feathers to land on the rooftops on the right. I found that you can get high enough, but when I first did it, Lakitu seemed to pick me up quite quickly. However, on an attempt soon after that landed closer to the edge of the roof, Lakitu didn't interfere at all. That gave me a small bit of hope that if I could stop dead on the edge of the roof, then maybe I could avoid Lakitu all the way to the end of the track. I realised soon after that I could use a feather into the item boxes to get 3 total bounces, and I could also trick into the right pole for some extra distance to get onto the rooftop. Of course, that doesn't tackle the problem of having too much speed when landing on the roof, but it did allow me to get up there with an extra feather to spare. At first, that seemed like it would have no benefit at all, but then I suddenly realised that the feather was exactly what I needed to get onto the roof with 0 speed. So on my next attempt I got onto the roof, fell off, but then I used the feather, then pressed the rewind button to get back on the roof, releasing it at the perfect time. If I didn't have the feather, I would have either hit the ground or the rewind would have taken me too far back, so the extra time it gave me was very useful. From there, I decided to drive as close to the edge as possible, and as you can see it was very sketchy. But the further I got, the more I believed Lakitu was actually going to ignore me. Eventually, I got to the end, jumped down onto the rail and did not get picked up. So, Guy Bazaar is actually possible to complete without touching the ground. Next up is Wario Stadium, a track I had fairly high hopes for thanks to how many rails there are. At the start I got onto the rail at the top of the right wall, then used a feather to get over to the left side, but then when I tried getting onto the next rail with the second feather I couldn't get high enough. On my best attempts I got close, but I wasn't convinced it was actually possible. So I thought instead that I could maybe get another feather from the item boxes and somehow use that to get the extra height, and when I first tried it I got very close to reaching the left rail. So I went back and tried again, aiming for the right rail this time, and after jumping off the wall and using the third feather I just about climbed high enough to attach to the rail. Of course you can then jump off that rail and easily land on the next one, and then I could use the second set of item boxes to replenish my feathers. After doing that I just stayed on the left side of the track, doing a couple of jumps in the process until I reached the end of the rail before the shortcut turn. When I tried just using 2 feathers to get onto the top rail, it was obviously not going to work, so I went back and I used 1 feather to get onto the earlier right rail, then jumped from that one up to the rail with 5 coins on it to get around the turn with 1 feather to spare. The biggest barrier was up next though. The huge ramp with non-drivable walls either side is a huge problem. I tried jumping off the rail then using my feather and I got nowhere close to making it to the top. The same thing happened when I jumped off the wall instead. I couldn't think of anything to make this work. You can get up to the top path rail instead, but you would have no feathers left, so that is entirely useless. You still get nowhere near high enough. Even if you somehow manage to get 2 feathers up to the top path, it still doesn't seem to work, so I think it's safe to say that Wario Stadium is not possible without touching the ground. Airship Fortress also has a lot of rails at the start of the track, so I could immediately progress quite far here just by taking the regular lines I would online. However, once I got to the end of the red rail, there was a wrench that forced me towards the road. I realised I could jump over the wrench onto the curved rail, then thought it might be possible to use a feather to attach to the wall on the first indoor turn. After a few attempts, I managed to do it, which then let me wrap around the turn until I was forced to the ground by the ceiling of the tunnel. Thankfully, I already knew you could do this turn then land on the next rail from a previous video, so I did eventually succeed with it, landing on the red rail then using a feather to get to the next one. I did try to save this feather after realising the fences to the right acted like a rail themselves, but I couldn't quite figure out how to then get on the next rails without touching the ground. The fences did come in handy though, because I could jump on them, then use a feather to land further on the next rails, which set me up for some crazy wall ride jumps to get all the way to the cannon glider without touching the ground. After the cannon glider there is a very long downward spiral, but you can actually ride the right wall all the way down by just constantly tricking as you go around the turn. However, I didn't have any feathers left, and I was fairly certain the final turn would require at least 1 feather to get past, so I had to somehow replenish my feathers using the final item set, despite the glider forcing you towards the ground before it. I tried tricking onto the left wall of the spiral at first, but I was just slightly too low to attach, but then I tried going onto the left side of the entrance instead, which worked perfectly, as I could use the extra height to then attach to the spiral wall, sending me into the double item box, then I could rewind back to the glider to avoid touching the ground. Straight after that I got onto the right wall, and as you can see you have to trick over and over and over again to stay low enough as you get around the turn. For this attempt I ended up at the top of the wall, preventing me from even trying the final turn. Soon afterwards though I got another try that was much lower at the exit of the spiral, so I tried using my 2 feathers to bounce to the rail before the finish line, but ever so slightly fell short. So I kept trying, and after many attempts I had one that managed to get on the left rail using 1 feather bounce, so I could then jump off the end of that rail and use the second feather to get over to the final rail, letting me cross the line and prove Airship Fortress is possible without touching the ground. Moving on to DK Pass, I immediately noticed the rail on the left side at the start, but it only took me to the entrance of the tunnel, which looked like a difficult barrier already. I tried attaching to the wall then using a feather, but realised it would probably be better to do it the other way around. That went decently well when I first tried it, as I managed to get an extra feather from the item boxes when switching from the left wall to the right wall, but I couldn't see anything I could use after the tunnel, especially after I had almost the same result when going from the right wall first instead. I tried more times, and this was probably my best attempt. I got a super mini turbo on the rail, but then jumped off the orange wall instead of the rail for some extra speed, but it didn't get me that much further than before, so I think DK Pass is impossible to complete. The next one on the list is Starview Peak, and when I got to the end of lap 1 I had an idea immediately. The barriers on the right side conveniently lead to the golden rail, so if I could get on top of one of them and then jump across the rest, it might be possible to reach it. And it turns out you can get on top of the barriers quite easily with a charge jump. Then you can hop over the small gaps to avoid falling back down as you reduce your speed. Of course, I needed to keep hopping to get across every single one of them, which was fairly easy to do when going in a straight line. However, when the barriers start to curve around the turn, it gets a bit tricky, so I had to take my time to align myself for each jump. Despite the tediousness of it, I actually found this really fun to do. I did fall off quite a few times, but when I eventually made it over to the rail, it was so satisfying. After that, I could jump to the rail on the left side using 1 feather, but then I couldn't jump over to the next rail on the right. Soon after though, I instead jumped straight forward and landed at the very bottom of the wall in front, letting me climb the wall and then get loads of airtime to let me land on the rail below, which I could then ride all the way to the glider, where there is a double item box to get my feathers back. The problem is that there is quite literally nothing you can use to avoid landing from the glider. I tried wall riding on the side of the road, but it doesn't let you attach at all. So sadly I had to end my Starview Peak run there, taking me to Skyhigh Sunday next. The start of this track had the same barriers as Starview Peak, so I just got on top of those again and jumped all the way across to the glider, where I thought I could maybe use a feather to reach the ledge on the right, but I fell a bit short when I tried it. So what I did instead was go all the way to the right onto this rail, then jump onto the ledge from there, which then led to the blue rail on the wide path. I could transfer over to the other blue rail soon after, and then I could jump down to the red rail below that, then I could jump from the end of that rail and make it onto the uphill rail using my 2 feathers, but I got them back immediately from the second item set using a rewind. The next straightaway section is easy. There is a designated path of rails you can take. By the end of it, I just jumped down to the right rail before the final item set, then I could use my feathers to reach the wall ride on the final turn. I quickly realised I could actually make it to the end of the wall ride with 2 feathers if I timed it right, and I would definitely need them to have any chance for the ending to work. My first idea for this ending was to just simply see how far the 2 feathers would get me, but on one of my first attempts, Lack 2 let me know there was a height limit which I thought might be a bit of a problem. I could still make it incredibly far without hitting the height limit, but I wasn't really sure anything more would be feasible. However, my second idea was to wall ride the side of the blue ice lolly for some extra distance, and then maybe wall ride the side of the road immediately after, even though it is very thin. Now, I had many attempts at this, and my best ones went fairly well but not perfectly, such as this one where I got the first wall ride but then didn't quite get the second one. I also managed to get to the first wall ride with only 1 feather, but I still couldn't attach to the side of the road, so my second feather wasn't even all that helpful. This remained the case for every single attempt I had, so eventually I had to reluctantly rule Skyhigh Sunday as impossible to complete. The next track is Wario Shipyard, and this one didn't start out great. This is because I needed to use my 2 feathers immediately, then bounce off a tree to get up onto the cliffs. From there though, I could get onto the uphill rail to make it a bit further, then drop down onto the next part of the cliff. After that, I just did a wall ride and bonked straight into Wario's face, giving me no hope of making any more progress. I did realise I could actually get 2 feathers up to the same spot if I went back to the start and used the rail next to the item set to replenish my feathers. Then if I landed on the boost panel, I could use a feather as I hit the item box and get so much height, enough to get to the top of the cliff. The thing is though, these 2 feathers are practically useless. As soon as I got in the little tunnel section, it became certain I was not going to get anywhere further, so I ruled out Wario Shipyard entirely. Now, Koopa Troopa Beach is the prime example of Lack 2 being annoying to deal with, because when I tried my first idea of jumping onto the wall on the left side, he immediately stopped me. I did find that he does allow you to be on the very edge of the wall, but it didn't matter. There were too many things blocking the path for anything to be done anyway. I did also try some parkour between the floating stands on the right, and did get from one stand to another, but after the second one there was literally nothing for me to progress with, so Koopa Troopa Beach could also be ruled out. The beginning of Away Oasis was fairly simple. I could wall ride on the left, then land on the rail in the off-road. I then tried bouncing off the poles in the water to get to the next rail without using my feather, but I realised that I probably wouldn't need to hold on to 2 feathers, so the next time I just used one to get over the water. This rail takes you around the entire uphill turn, and by the end I could just jump to the left onto the next rail. The jump at the end of this rail is quite a big one, but my first attempt using a feather and a pole bounce wasn't far off making it to the middle rail. So I just went back and got a super mini turbo on the rail for some extra speed, which helped me launch a bit further and land at the very start of the middle rail, which of course leads to the second set of item boxes. The next part was very easy. I just stayed on the left rail, then used 1 feather to avoid the water and land on the shortcut rail. From there, I could jump onto the rail on the outside of the platform, which wasn't exactly necessary, but it did help me figure out a way to replenish my feathers again using the final double item box, and I knew I would need some help from the feathers for this final section, because the waterfall turn is huge with nothing really around it to bounce off. The first thing I tried was a weird sequence involving a wall ride then 3 feather bounces rather than 2, and whilst it did get me pretty far, I felt I was not going to make up the distance I lacked on this attempt. So my other idea was to just use the ramp at the end of the platform, jump directly into the left wall and go as high as possible before jumping back off it, then use 2 feathers around the turn. To be fair, this method did get me further than the 3 feather method, but my best attempt was still fairly far away from getting to the wooden pole. I also tried going on the grass hill on the left after the item set for a more direct line, but that wasn't getting me anywhere either, making Away Oasis impossible to complete. Now we go on to Peach Beach, the 3rd section track of the video. To start off, I jumped up to the flower bed on the right and demolished a few barriers in the process. I could then go around the right side of the next flower bed onto a small ramp, then destroy another barrier, then drop onto a different barrier on the ground, then trick into a pole to get onto the next flower bed, then I could destroy a few more barriers, go around onto the ramp again, drop onto the grass hill, and then slowly maneuver around the edge to avoid getting picked up by Lakitu. The next thing to do was to make it over to the small island, but to do so I used both my feathers, then tricked into one of the trees. But before I landed I rewinded back before the trees, and this time they just stopped me dead on the grass. However, I did actually find a way to get my feathers back by just landing on the boost ramp before I rewinded, but this time I travelled further before having to rewind, letting me just drop onto the grass without the trees helping me out. It would have been great if these feathers helped me make it much further, but sadly all I could do from there was jump onto the cliffside on the right and get a brief wall ride before hitting the ground. However, I thought I should carry on and see how far I could get in the other two sections of the track, so I got 2 feathers and started again from the beginning of section 2. This section started well, as I could use 1 feather to get into the water fountain, then use my other feather to get onto the rail on the right side of the first uphill. I then managed to replenish my feathers by stopping on the rail, turning around on the brick wall, going backwards on the rail, grabbing the item box, then quickly rewinding before Lakitu picked me up for facing in the wrong direction. I then used 1 feather to jump across the road to the left rail, just about surviving the landing. At the end of this left rail, I did a small bounce off the green fences to get onto the small ledge, then I gathered a charge jump and released it into the wall, jumped across to the right wall, used a feather to land on the yellow rail, jumped off the wrench, landed on another rail further down, then tricked to the right onto this golden rail on the outside. This rail takes you all the way around the next turn and has a double item box on it as well. At the end of it, I tricked onto another rail higher up, which then allowed me to jump onto the glider panel at the start of section 3, so the entirety of section 2 is possible. The same can't be said for section 3 though, since you immediately have the massive water section that is nowhere near feasible. I couldn't even reach the next item set before plummeting into the water. We're now at the halfway point of the tracks, but before we get into the second half, I'm going to bring it back to Crown City, since I didn't go through section 2 or 3 on that track at the start of the video. Just to remind you, section 1 was possible and it ended off with me riding on top of a lorry as I crossed the line. So I wanted to try and continue with section 2 without replenishing my feathers to see how far I could theoretically make it in one go. The problem with that is immediately after crossing the line, the lorry goes off the track to the right, which means that I actually needed the feathers to make any more progress. Now, it is possible to get these feathers without touching the ground, but it is very complicated. From the lorry, you can jump onto this fence, then get a weird bounce onto the rail above it. After that, the jump to the next rail is slightly too far, but if you were to make it without touching the ground, you could then replenish your feathers at the item set, then use one of them to jump back onto the lorry. The problem with that is the only option afterwards is to jump onto the ledge on the left side of the next turn, but I could only ever make it when I had 2 feathers instead of 1. So there are 2 problems, the rail to rail jump being too long, and the fact you need 2 feathers for the next turn. For the second problem, after replenishing your feathers, you can then stand still at the start of the second rail, then trick to the left at low speed and land on the lorry without having to use a feather. For the first problem, you can use the poles on the right to get over the gap, so both problems are solved, right? Well, not exactly. If you use the poles, then replenish your feathers, then rewind to stop on the rail, you will not be far back enough on the rail to jump onto the lorry without using a feather. So, you would have to use the poles, replenish your feathers, go back to the first rail, use a feather to jump straight to the second rail, replenish your feathers again, then rewind to stop at the start of the second rail. All of this takes so much time, by the end of it the lorry you originally jumped off will be long gone. Now the obvious answer is to just wait for the next one, but when I tried this I realised that the car cycles on Crown City seem to be completely random, and most of the time there was only ever 1 lorry in the left lane for the entire 10 minutes of the race. Luckily I did eventually get a cycle that had 2 lorries appear separately in the left lane, so you can technically do it, but it entirely relies on getting a lucky car cycle. Now I was hoping all that effort to get here would be worth it, but it turns out all you can do after the turn is jump onto the boost ramp, get a small wall ride, then land at the end of the rail, but after that there is nothing else you can do. As for section 3, I kicked things off with a charge jump into the left pillar, then I landed on the fence, then combined 2 feathers with another 2 pole bounces to give me enough momentum to land all the way on the rail on the outside of the next turn. At the end of this rail, I tricked into the wall on the right, then bounced off the pole to land on the cliff wall on the left, but then I was a bit stuck for what to do. Lakitu is a bit annoying in this spectator area, so any trick I did from there always resulted in getting picked up. I figured out that if I could somehow get onto the next wall, I could then replenish my feathers, rewind back onto the rail, then do the same sequence again, but instead use my 2 feathers to land on the rooftop on the inside of the next turn. Sadly though, I couldn't get anything to work. This was my best attempt, where I tricked off the first arrow sign and Lakitu picked me up before I could turn any further. Maybe with a perfect angle this is possible, but I felt it was best to just move on. The second half of tracks begins with Salty Salty Speedway, a track I felt was definitely going to be possible. At the start, I went up the ramp before the line and jumped to the rooftop on the left. Then I gathered a charge jump, did a wall ride on the buildings, then used 2 feathers to get all the way to the top of the waterfall. From there, I got onto the green rail on the outside of the turn, then jumped onto the red rail in the middle, taking me to the regular shortcut path. Then I could take the normal shortcut lines I would do online, except I needed to use 1 feather to avoid landing in the water when getting up to the glider path. Thankfully, I could get that feather back as there are item boxes on the glider panel. Of course, I just used 1 feather to take the rail shortcut at the end, jumped from rail to rail like normal, tricked into the pole, used my second feather and then landed on the ground just before the finish line. What a howler. Don't worry though, there are a couple of ways around this. The cooler one being to trick into the blue pole at the end of the glider to get up to the rail without using a feather, allowing me to use 2 feathers to avoid landing on the ground after tricking off the pole, which was extremely easy to do. So I was right, Salty Salty Speedway is possible without touching the ground. A track I had less confidence with is Dino Dino Jungle, but it turns out this one is pretty crazy. To begin, I tried jumping off the finish line pole whilst the dinosaurs were there to see what happened, and I don't think I need to add anything else, the clip speaks for itself. After that though, I tried without the dinosaurs, and with the help of 2 feather bouncers and a pole bounce, I made it onto the balcony, but before I could try anything from there, Lakitu picked me up. After a few more tries, I got an even better outcome, as I managed to go high enough from the second feather to land all the way onto the top platform, and I was surprised Lakitu didn't pick me up here. I wasn't complaining though. I then jumped onto the broken bridge ramp to get to the cliff wall, and after that I accidentally landed on the fences, which was at least better than landing on the ground. However, it was pretty clear I would probably need another feather to make it anywhere from here. Luckily, I managed to get up to the platform again, but this time using my first feather as I hit the item boxes, so I still had 1 feather left when I landed. This extra feather helped out a ton, as I could use it after wall riding to land on the left fences instead, which sends me straight onto the red rail. I could then replenish my feathers using the double item box and continue grinding the rail. At the end of it, I did some wall ride jumps and then used a feather to get up to the top path, where there is another set of item boxes. From this path I just sent it, and quite frankly I got further than I expected to, landing on top of the archway, then getting to the other side of the bridge after a second feather bounce. Of course this still wasn't ideal, so I went back and tried some other things. The most promising idea was to land on the fences, wall ride the side of the arch, then use my 2 feathers, because that got me onto the cliff wall after the bridge. It wasn't yet enough to get me past the final turn, but then I managed to do this. I landed on a ledge in the cliff wall, and after a few rewinds I managed to fully stop, even with a feather to spare as well. From there I reversed up the tree rail, got a trick boost from it, then managed to jump off the wall and land on the inside of the turn, which you would think Lakitu would prevent me from doing. For some reason though, Lakitu doesn't seem to care at all here, because I could then turn around and just drive on the right side of the grass, which was enough to land down on another cliffside ledge. From here I could charge jump onto the rail, trick to the right, use a feather and cross the finish line. So in the end, unbelievably, Dino Dino Jungle is possible to complete without touching the ground. Great Question Block Ruins has a bit of a shorter story to tell. Basically, the only options at the start are to either charge jump to the left, which has absolutely no potential after you bounce off a few trees, or to charge jump to the right, use a feather, trick off 2 trees, use another feather, then try to land on the fence. However, even if you get on the fence, there is nothing you can do from there, just a wall ride taking you back onto the ground. So yeah, this track was very quickly ruled out. The beginning of Cheep Cheep Falls has several rails and poles, but the way I started here was not how I expected to. After gathering an Ultra Mini Turbo before the finish line, I charge jumped into one of the red poles, but got sent much higher than I anticipated and actually got onto this rope. From there, I jumped towards the item boxes, used my feather, then spammed my item button to get an extra feather bounce before landing on the ground. Later, I got another attempt up to the rope, and once again used my second feather on the item boxes, but this time I managed to bounce onto the yellow fence, which was nearly enough to attach to the wall on the uphill turn. However, I then realised I could instead grab the item box and then rewind, stopping back on the rope. I could then reverse on the rope, gather some speed, jump off and use a feather as I hit the item box, then use the other 2 feathers to get around the turn mid-air, landing on the right rail. After that, I could get onto 2 more rails, but then after the turn there is a big jump to make for a subsequent wall ride. Sadly, I couldn't make this jump work at all. Landing on the yellow fence seemed to be the best idea, but it just wasn't going to happen. So, unless you can get a feather to this section, Cheep Cheep Falls is impossible. For Dandelion Depths, I started off with a wall ride on the right side of the finish line, jumped into the pole, then used a feather as I hit the item set, getting me to the rail on the right side of the bridge. From that rail, I could use my 2 feathers to bounce all the way across to this red wall. Then I simply dropped down onto the rail to set myself up for the top path. When I got up to this path, I wasn't really sure what to do, so I just charge jumped onto the right wall and hoped for the best. Used both my feathers as I slowly flew through the air, landed on a wall at the start of the cave, and then fell into the water. This attempt wasn't great, but it did give me a good idea for how to make more progress. After jumping off the right wall again, I instead only used 1 feather, then landed on the next wall, then used another feather. This got me all the way onto the wall on the very right side of the cave, where I could then trick up to the random platform that serves no real purpose. I did have to rewind to actually stay on the platform, but then I could jump over to the second useless platform that actually has a double item box, which is pretty nice. The problem now is that I'm miles away from the steep uphill, so I had to use both my feathers after jumping off the wall to make it to the second set of boost ramps, which isn't exactly ideal when you consider that there are 5 sets in total. I did manage to get an attempt that landed on the left rail next to the boost panels, but after the rail ends, all I could really do was jump over the 3rd boost panel and hit the ground, so Dandelion Depths is not possible thanks to this ending. Boo Cinema has a straightaway section with fences either side at the very beginning, and after many attempts I managed to get a random bounce from one of them, which helped me get very close to landing on the shortcut rail on the right, but even if I did make it, I didn't think there would be anything else to do from there. So I tried the same thing on the right side instead, and it resulted in a wall ride on the left side of the entrance, and even though I was too low in this attempt, I felt it had serious potential. After many more tries, I got much higher up on the wall, and then pulled off a sequence of wall tricks after using 1 feather to perfectly align me for a landing on the right rail with 1 feather to spare. The next section had even more fences either side of the road, and it seemed like they might be quite useful after I tricked off the curved rail, used a feather, and then managed to bounce off one of the fences to get on the boost ramp. The problem is that the next rail is on the very left side of the road, so I thought it would be necessary to bounce off the left fences instead. Well, I sort of succeeded, because I got to the left fences, bounced onto the boost ramp, but then didn't get close to the rail. However, when I rewinded, I somehow timed it perfectly to stop on top of the penultimate fence, an insanely lucky moment that would actually matter, because I could then jump to the final fence, align myself, then jump onto the very bottom of the boost ramp as I turned towards the left rail, which was just enough to land on it. I could then replenish my feathers on the item set, and use a feather as I hit the item set again to switch over to the right rail. However, the fun ends here, because the next straightaway section is so long, even getting an ultra mini turbo on the rail doesn't get me close at all to landing on the next rail. So Boo Cinema isn't possible, but the fact I made it as far as I did is nothing short of a miracle. Now we get to Dry Bones Burnout, and this is the track that I was referencing in the intro when I said there is one track that is a bit dodgy with the rule set. Basically, when the race begins, you are on the ground, but once you are past the first big turn, there is now some new ground below where you drive, so you have 2 pieces of ground on top of each other that are still technically linked together, since you can reach the bottom section from the start line if you drove backwards. The other issue is that the top path has a finish line on it, so should anything that's connected to that also count as the ground? I decided it shouldn't because you can never start a race from the top path, but admittedly it is a bit questionable. Thanks to the rules though, everything this top path is linked to isn't the ground, because the final things linked to the start line are the 2 ramps in the middle. Everything after that is not directly linked. Of course, this meant I could just drive the track normally up until the very end, where I just did a feather shortcut to get up to the glider path on the left, which of course let me cross the finish line with ease. So, by the rules, dry Bones Burnout does count as possible without touching the ground, but it is slightly dodgy. Either way, I'm counting it and moving swiftly on to the next track, Mumu Meadows. All you can really do here is charge jump off the finish line pole, land on the fence, feather over to the next fence, then replenish your feathers, do the small wall bounce shortcut, ride the rail for a bit, then jump into an empty field with practically nothing to use to get any further. You can switch over to the right rail if you want, but it won't help much. You still end up making the same progress as before. So yeah, Mumu Meadows is very easily ruled out. Honestly, the same can be said for Choco Mountain, because literally all you can do is get on this rock on the first turn, and that is it. I tried going from the top path to see if that could give me speed to do anything, but it really doesn't. You can't reach the item set or the rail directly opposite, making this another easy track to rule out. A track with a very different story though is Toad's Factory, as I could make progress immediately with a double feather jump up to the top path entering the factory. There is an item set up here to get my feathers back, and I used one of them as I jumped across the left wall in the factory to get over to the right rail on the next turn. I then jumped over to the slanted rail on the moving platform, then I was a bit all over the place as I tried to replenish my feathers without touching the ground. I did manage it though using the right rail and some rewinding. Eventually I got onto the slanted rail on the second moving platform, which I could then trick from to get onto the rail above the path in the second indoor section. At the end of this rail I could either jump right or left, but it was clear to me after a few tries that the only way around this turn would be to jump to the right, use a feather and attach to the outside wall, because that was consistently getting me to the start of the red tunnel section. And I ended up being correct about that, because eventually I got a wall ride that set me up really well for the red tunnel, because I landed on the left wall, tricked off the slanted part of it, used a feather, and then somehow managed to do 2 more wall tricks without falling off to get onto the boost ramp, which of course leads me to the double crane shortcut. But after the 4 tractors, there is quite a long straightaway I needed to get past. By the way, I decided to allow myself to drive on the tractors since I felt like counting vehicles as part of the ground didn't make any sense. Either way, I needed to find a way to get past this final straightaway. My first idea was to get up to the spectator stands, and when I got a weird bounce off the rail, I did land on one of them. However, Lakitu picked me up when I got there, making me worry this wouldn't be possible. I decided to then try and complete it with feathers in case I could get feathers to the end, and it was fairly easy to make it over the finish line with 2 feather bounces. So I went back to the tunnel section to try and bring feathers with me from the final item set, and on one attempt I did get the double item box, but then couldn't properly reattach to the wall, sending me straight to the ground. On another attempt, I had a very similar approach to the tunnel, but this time I had slightly less speed as I hit the item boxes. I did still attach to the wall, but I had to use one of my feathers to avoid hitting the ground before the boost ramp. So I needed to figure out if the ending would be possible with only 1 feather. Well, it turns out if you just trick off the rail with more speed, you get launched a lot further, which allowed me to get over the finish line with only 1 feather bounce. So Toad's Factory is possible to complete without touching the ground. On Bowser's Castle, I could charge jump to the left and take the rail path up to the top at the start, and then I could trick across the rails at the end to get onto the curved rail below. After that, on my first try, I ended up getting absolutely owned by a fire bubble, but the next time I managed to use my feathers to reach the item set. After a few rewinds, I was able to get 2 feathers, use one into the item set, then use another one to reach the glider, leaving me with 1 feather left over for the next section. However, using this feather literally does nothing when the glider is still active. I could instead trick all the way onto the right fence, and after that I managed to do a very scuffed version of the wall ride shortcut, then used my feather, which got me to the ramp before the next turn. I realised later that if you rewind after doing 1 attempt, you will end up going very slowly into the fence ride, and that actually sets you up perfectly for the wall ride shortcut, giving me hope that maybe something could actually be done here with more control. The only real idea I had though was to use the coil to give myself an extra bounce, then use a feather, then maybe use the second coil to take the wall ride shortcut that the world record does, since it gets you onto the next glider. I had many attempts at this, and it became pretty clear over time that it would be very difficult to make work, because whenever I tricked off the second coil, I didn't get much vertical momentum, so the trick off the next wall was always just going towards the void. This attempt on screen now was my best of the lot, and even though it wasn't enough to continue on the track, it does show that there is a small chance it could be possible, but for this video I'm afraid I have to rule it out. There isn't much to talk about for Acorn Heights. You can only really get to the start of the tunnel using 3 feather bouncers, because once you get onto the wall you are automatically aiming towards the ground thanks to the turn going uphill. So we can immediately rule that one out as impossible. Next up is Mario Circuit, which of course is another section track. To begin section 1, you can feather up onto the block wall and then continue around the track for nearly the entire thing. This lasts up until the very end of the section, where there is sadly nothing you can combine a feather jump with to make it over to section 2, so section 1 isn't possible to complete. Section 2 is a lot more interesting though, starting off with a double feather and a pole bounce to land on the wall next to the shortcut, which you can drive on, but you have to be very careful of Lakitu picking you up. After that, you stay on the wall for a bit longer until you reach this triangle block, where you have to use your spare feather to jump across to the other side of the road. Once again, you keep driving on the wall until you reach the big boost ramp jump. You can actually charge jump onto the higher wall right next to the ramp without falling off, and from there I had the idea to jump to the left side where the 2 flagpoles are. At first I couldn't quite get enough distance, but it turns out that if I didn't stop after doing the charge jump it would give me the extra speed I needed to make it over. Once I got there, I realised it would be much better to be on the right side instead, so I tried getting up onto the wall just before the boost panels to help me get across. This was incredibly tedious, but I did eventually do it. I just had to take a bit of time to turn around once I got up there. I desperately did not want to fall off. I made it to the other side eventually, but there was still quite a bit more to do. First off, I could charge jump off the blocks to reach the item set, and it turns out that was enough to make the entirety of section 2 possible. Of course, I wanted to stay off the ground for as long as possible, so after I got my 2 feathers, I tried tricking off the pipe on the right and landing on the wall, but Lakitu is not a fan of that idea. But I could instead just wall ride after the pipe, and that got me up to the stone ledge on the right. I then had to slowly maneuver on extremely thin sections of the ledge, which resulted in this ridiculous clip of me somehow not falling onto the road, despite it looking like I was doomed the entire time. Sadly, it didn't really matter, because I needed more speed with my 2 feather bouncers in order to get onto the next block wall. After that realisation, I somehow managed to squeeze out a mini turbo before using the feathers, but that actually gave me too much speed, so I went flying past the wall. So the perfect middle ground was to charge jump into the blue pillar, giving me more height but less speed as I used my feathers, getting me onto the red block. After landing, I tried just driving on the wall regularly, but Lakitu made it clear I had to be precise in my movement. So I went back and stayed as close to the edge of the blocks as possible, and this worked for a while. However, as I got close to the right turn, Lakitu decided to be overly strict and completely block the path. Now, I tried jumping over to the wall after the red triangle block, but each time I was either going off the wall to the left due to having too much speed, or I was going to the right and getting picked up by Lakitu. I felt it might be possible to stop dead if you did it perfectly, but it didn't really matter if it was possible or not, because Lakitu is just as strict on another turn soon afterwards, where there is definitely no workaround, so I could safely say section 3 is not possible alongside section 1. At first on Peach Stadium, I thought there was going to be absolutely nothing possible, because after using 2 feathers and tricking off the tree in the grass, I was not even close to landing on the next rail on the left side of the uphill. However, I suddenly remembered seeing a crazy shortcut here that involved the Royal Motors sign and the tree, but I couldn't fully recall what it looked like. So I asked Optic if there was a clip of it anywhere, and it turns out I wasn't making things up. You can trick off the black poles and then trick off both the white poles and the tree to get over the grass without any items. So I thought I would give that a go for this challenge, and when I made it I then used my 2 feathers like before, but this time it was actually enough to make it onto the rail. This rail does sadly lead to nothing. You can trick off another pole, but then you'll just fall into the void. So Peach Stadium is impossible, but at least the start section was cool. That of course leads us to the final track in the game, Rainbow Road. This track is 4 minutes long and has 4 different sections, so the odds were definitely against me completing this one. Well, my mission to beat the odds lasted for a few seconds as I charge jumped onto a fence, then used one feather to get onto the side of the road, then used another feather after detaching, then wrapped around the turn until I got back onto the road. So that was section 1 ruled out pretty quickly, but section 2 is a slight bit better. I could get to the glider panel but only ever with one feather left, so I then tried to stay in the glider for as long as possible. I used the feather to avoid landing before the bump in the water, but I could not avoid being forced to the ground for much longer after that. Section 3 starts in the exact same way as section 2, getting to the cannon glider with one feather left. However, this time there was an item set to grab by using my remaining feather, letting me replenish. This let me then have 3 feather bounces at the end of the glider, which of course meant nothing as I had to land on the ground anyway, but at least I made it further than you would normally. Section 4 actually starts in the glider itself, so I could carry 2 feathers the whole time up until the landing zone. Of course, when I got there I was being forced towards the ground, but the feathers let me get to the double item box, so I could rewind with 2 more feathers and use them to get as far as possible, which turns out was practically where I would have landed without rewinding in the first place. So yeah, Rainbow Road was absolutely impossible in every way as expected. This means that out of the 30 tracks, you can complete a full lap without touching the ground on 8 of them. Collectively on the section tracks, I completed 9 out of 19 different sections, 6 of them coming from DK Spaceport. There are of course a few things that I couldn't succeed with that might still be possible, so feel free to try them out yourself, and I may have also just missed something entirely, who knows. If you stuck around until the end, I greatly appreciate it. If you would leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel, it would be class. Of course, let me know your thoughts in the comments, along with any other ideas you would be interested in seeing. For now though, thanks for watching, I'll see you at some point in the future. So there are 2 problems, the rail to rail jump being too long, and the fact you need 2 feathers for the next turn. And the fact you need 2 feathers for the next turn. And the fact you need 2 feathers for the next turn.